What makes an interaction meaningful? Or perhaps, what does it mean when we speak of meaningful or the absence thereof? Hello everyone, I'm Priscilla van Eve, your philosopher at service today, and I will be giving a talk about meaningful interactions. This video is based on a lecture I gave in honor of 20 years of MINT Lab, Meaningful Interactions Lab, at the KU Leuven during a celebration last June. I'm a communication researcher at MINT Lab for about 6 years now, and I always enjoyed working in a lab that wants to foster not useful, not effective, not successful, not engaging, but meaningful interactions. Now, I want to invite you to join me on an exploration as to what meaningful actually entails. A first step in this exploration requires for you to take a pen and a piece of paper, and I would like you to write down your own reflections on what you consider to be meaningful and a meaningful interaction. You can walk a bit around, drink something refreshing or warming, and think of meaningful and just describe what it means to you. I'll see you back in a few minutes, or maybe even much later. Welcome back. Now, unfortunately, I can't ask you what type of associations and experiences crossed your mind because of this indirect video format, but we do have some options for interactions. You can post them in the comments or send them by email after you have watched this video. As a next step, I will discuss my own reflection process. If you have some additional thoughts during this out loud reflection, you can write them down in another color or on another piece of paper. Perhaps there are some things that you would like to include on your notes or that you would like to discuss afterwards. Now, talking about meaningful interactions is not an easy task, considering that meaningful is quite a philosophical and existential term. It is an experience, but what is this experience? It is also a way of doing something, but what is specific about the meaningful way of doing something? And interactions encompasses different layers and a wide range of exchanges with science, with technology, with design, with language, with communication, with images, the environment, and with different levels of intensity. So, how to approach a lecture about something so philosophical and complex? Well, a first step to start a lecture on what meaningful interactions means is asking myself what would make this lecture and its exchanges meaningful today. Of course, what might make it meaningful to me may not be the same as what would make it meaningful to you. Since you are talking about reflections, and reflections are an individual and personal process, I came up with the following approach to leave room for both my and your reflections. 1. I let you think briefly in advance what meaningful means to you, uninfluenced by my reflection, yet maybe influenced by other reflections, uses, or habits. And then as a next step, I'm going to think out loud of what meaningful has meant to me and my research throughout the years. I will analyze these experiences and see whether I can discover some underlying principles that make meaningful meaningful. You will be reflecting about the meaning of meaningful along with me during this articulated reflection process. Now, my reflection may change or add something to what you have written down, and it can also lead to new potential thinking lines that I have not thought of myself. Well, let's get to it. Now, my reflection starting point of the day has been this talk itself. Before developing this lecture talk, I had some meaningful conversations with colleagues and friends about my lecture on meaningfulness. Well, I actually mainly sighed and said I was not sure what I should precisely discuss and the way I should be giving the lecture. There are a lot of expectations and high standards when a philosopher starts talking about meaningfulness. Now, I did know what I didn't want to do. I didn't want to give a happy, feel good, yet empty talk, something which I consider to be meaningless. I see the word meaningful passing more and more by in science outreach and initiatives. And it has gotten quite a buzzing ring to it over the years. Meaningful hints at something positive, something promising, and it is associated with wisdom. It's very easy to use, and it's a powerful word to use, but it is also abstract, so it can mean just about anything, and you can easily speak the word without revealing what it precisely entails. Furthermore, it also leads to automatic approval. Yes, all the typical traits of a buzzword. Also, I wanted to leave room for the audience exchanges, especially since I would be giving a talk on meaningful interactions. But I also didn't want to just randomly start brainstorming and function mainly as some sort of a workshop guide. So, what did I do to make my own lecture meaningful? Well, I started with the insight to take the event itself as part of the reflection, as I discussed, and the reflection about meaningful being a buzzword. Meaningful is a highly complex concept to communicate about, yet we need to clarify what it indicates to avoid it from having a monumental emptiness. Yet it is not an easy task. Therefore, I decided to discuss tangible examples, experiences, encounters of mine during this lecture, including the lecture. And these examples of and reflections on meaningful exchanges can help us to think and speak about something metaphysical and ungraspable. Another idea that came to mind was that from an analytical perspective, it is also interesting to think about meaningless. We are not talking about meaning today, but meaningful, which implies a meaningless, and using this contrast can actually help us see something more clearly. Now, what is it that we miss when something is not meaningful? What is it that we are doing or not doing when an exchange becomes meaningless? At occasions, it is difficult to think and talk about meaningfulness, especially when we just cannot feel it and suffer from the burden of being. During such moments, we have an opportunity to understand what it is that we are not feeling or lacking. Now, I would personally describe these feelings in terms of apathy, irrelevance, unimportance, insignificance. A lack of feeling itself. A lack of feeling that what you do, what you put or have put your life energy in, is of value. Perhaps it was all just wasted energy. What was it all for? So we do discover some foundational components of meaningfulness when we are lacking it. And I will also consider during this lecture what it means when meaningfulness is lacking. And the final clue for the lecture approach was that I needed a reflective approach, ensuring that I would not just be talking about meaningful interactions to an audience, but that I invited them to reflect both individually and along with me, despite the format. So, what can I already learn regarding meaningfulness based on my short lecture reflection? Well, when we speak of meaningful interaction, we speak of an experience and the result of an exchange with someone or something. For example, in this case, what the audience will experience, what the lecturer will experience. And we also speak of a particular way of doing something, how I am giving the lecture. Also, when you want to approach something meaningfully, you need to reflect about both content and form. To make this lecture meaningful, I aligned content, what I'm talking about, and form, the way in which the content is translated and brought, and embedded it in an interactive component in the approach. Now, I wanted to avoid just talking in content about meaningful interactions. And I would like to add to that the approach I'm taking makes my lecture meaningful, but it may not make another lecture meaningful. So we always have to think about the audience and the content of what you are bringing. Whether something is meaningful or not depends on the context and thus requires contextual correspondence, which is another trait of meaningfulness. Furthermore, an exchange can also be indirect, and in fact, a direct exchange is not necessarily direct. Firstly, when you deliver a one-way message, people will think about it and maybe talk about it and maybe even do something with it. This is also a form of interactivity and exchange. For example, as we are doing right now, there is no fixed feedback loop, there is no fixed follow-up on what you do with it, but if you want to, you can let me know about your experiences and thoughts. You can put it in the comments, you can send me an email, but it will be completely up to the audience to take the initiative. Secondly, when there is a direct interaction and a planned feedback loop, this doesn't necessarily mean that you will actually do something with it. with this feedback or with a response. You can just collect it and you can perfectly ignore it. Such an interaction is not genuine. And here we touch upon an important trait of meaningfulness that we can add to our discovery process, namely authenticity. Now, I have done research about science communication for the past 5 years. Within this research, I reflected a lot about meaningful communication and language use, not just in theory, but also in practice, including my own practice. After all, if I would not apply what I say and think to what I personally do, I would make my speech pure rhetorical and ideological and empty out the meaning of what I say. I would be very inconsistent. It would make my interactions meaningless. Indeed, for a meaningful interaction, there should be a strong connectedness and coherence between what you say, think, and do. Now, I know this may sound quite evident. However, one important discovery I made during my research is that the more evident things appear, the less they actually are. We have grown so accustomed to doing certain things in certain ways and hearing certain things so repetitively, constantly hearing them over and over again, that we might not be aware that we haven't actually thought of what we say or what the implications are of what we say. We may use certain words and concepts of which we may think that we know what we mean by them and that they express what we think, while we have actually been taught to say them. We might just be parroting without being aware of it. An example hereof is I am a philosopher and I was wondering why there is a PH in the PhD. Why am I a doctor of philosophy and social sciences and not just a doctor? Why is it in its Latin originating meaning present, this word of philosophy? So I started asking people who were aiming for a PhD, who obtained a PhD, who are granting a PhD. And I thought it was quite unsettling to find out that nobody could give an answer to this question. I even had to conduct a lot of research to get an answer to my question. Now, I'm not going deeper into this during this talk, but you can always read my PhD if you're interested in this journey. If we speak of such a title, the PhD title, without knowing what we actually mean by it, we are emptying out its meaning, which has consequences for its practice. And there has also been written about that. We discussed that some words and concepts escape our conscious attention and consideration, a disruption between what we say and think, which has implications and consequences. Now, there might also be a disruption in what we say and do. I'm not talking about consciously saying something different from what you do, which would hint at hypocrisy and malintent, but about not being aware of it. We may think that we do what we say because we are so convinced of what we say. But some habits, templates, expectations, procedures, formats that we have grown so accustomed to mold and shape what we actually do. Let me give you an example. I attended an academic symposium about indigenous knowledges and the environment a while ago. It was emphasized how other cultural traditions are to help us to think and approach the environment differently, to help us reconnect with nature and tackle the climate crisis, something which is much needed. Now, scholars from a non-Western background were invited to talk about it, as Western approaches to knowledge and colonization were considered to be one of the problems. The intentions were noble, the message important, the discourse great. One would almost forget that international academics trained in a Western system gave very scholarly talks in an academic setting with well-structured PowerPoints containing endless slides, with much belief in what they were saying, explaining how we need to do things differently. You can fill in the dots. A big issue here is that there was so much excitement and enthusiasm about the content of the lectures and the promising words that people couldn't see how the approach and format itself, the conference, was as typical for a Western approach to knowledge translation as can be. From the PowerPoint presentations with a short time for questions afterwards to the panel, and of course, as a follow-up, an edited volume with articles about the lectures. Secondly, Internationalization should not be confused with decolonization. The speakers were scholars, trained in a very Western way of approaching knowledge and communicating about knowledge, and they were not actual carriers of indigenous wisdom. Of course, carriers of indigenous wisdom would not be communicating about what they do and how they do it in PowerPoint formats and in a structured speech at a conference. They learn by doing and translate their knowledge through apprenticeship, not by speech. Another issue is that speaking about reconnecting with nature is not the same thing as actually reconnecting with nature. It was an ideological and rhetorical reconnecting, but this doesn't mean that there is an actual reconnecting in practice. How many of the speakers actually work and interact with nature consciously? Now, how meaningful is undertaking a symposium on other ways of thinking when you are very critical in what you say and think, but are not conscious that you are actually not critical about what and how you are doing it? In the conference form and in the reconnecting with nature efforts. What's more, even when you are conscious about it, you are often forced to follow this form in order to be allowed to participate. And when you participate, you have like the issue that you are legitimating it yourself in the process. So it is a true catch-22. Now, here is where forging your own truthful path comes in. What is characteristic of meaningfulness is not just connectedness, but also individuality. You need consciousness to see certain gaps and to notice that some existing bridges are shaky and not solid at all. You have to be creative and look for other ways to bridge such gaps. Truthfulness, another trait of meaningfulness, reveals an ethical dimension of meaningful interactions where we find a personal responsibility to make sure that what you say and do is truthful, even when this can come at a cost. Okay, so besides to these disruptions between saying, thinking, and doing, we have grown accustomed to expressing ourselves in language. I'm talking about meaningful, but meaningful is itself a word. Now, the words we use are of great importance because words have a creative nature and also a material dimension. And sometimes we may forget that what seems to be a little nuance is actually a great difference and enrichment. Take, for example, if we speak of knowledge production, I think of a factory. If we speak of knowledge creation, I think of human activity, one that is marked by creativity. Another example I really like is the word not unimportant, something which philosophers, including me, like to say. Now, an editor in social sciences may remark, just write important for clarity. This is inefficient and less accessible to a broader audience. But not unimportant is not the same as important, and not important is also not the same as not unimportant and important. Philosophy, right? Now, not unimportant versus important, we could say not unimportant. It's something we should bear in mind and deserves our attention as it has an impact or something to do with it. Versus important, you really need to pay attention to this, it plays a central role. Versus not important, it's not really relevant and should not get too much attention, but we should also not forget about this. So what can we take away from this? Is that meaningfulness is not just in the big things, but it is also in the little things or things that may seem little. They are not unimportant. Now, I also have done research on meaningful interactions with technology, more specifically in museum settings with youngsters and museum professionals. Many museum professionals find it very important to introduce technology in their museums. The museum of the 21st century cannot be without it, of course. People expect it, as it will attract more visitors to the museum, increasing its popularity. It's the path of modernity. But interestingly, nobody mentioned that it would be an enrichment for the collection as such. Now, some professionals are a bit more reluctant and fear that the museum may become more of a fun park. So we can conclude that if we want to have interaction with technology and we want it to be meaningful, that we need to find a certain balance. So, we did some co creation activities with different stakeholders to inquire how we can find such a meaningful balance. And we had three important factors. One, technology should resonate with the people, it should be what they call in human computer interaction user friendly, and be intuitive. And it should also correspond with the collection. Secondly, it should be a supplement and addition. If not, it may very well be just a barrier and a distraction to the collection. It may be harmful to the collection, so we need to avoid redundancy. Change should have a purpose. Which brings us to the last one. If technology is used, there should also be a plan for maintenance. Somebody should be responsible for the follow up. What's the use if the technology doesn't work anymore and nobody in the museum can fix it? This is a very practical matter, but a very important one. Change requires energy, and change for changing is not sustainable. So, now talking about meaningful use of technology, I'm going to go back to the beginning of the lecture, the reflection on this lecture, and my own practice. When developing this lecture, I had to consider the use of a technological tool that we have grown so accustomed to that we often don't even see it as a technological tool anymore, a PowerPoint. Typically, academia. Using PowerPoint has an impact on the interaction with your audience. Up until now, I have chosen to avoid using it in this video. Why? When having a PowerPoint, people will be looking at the PowerPoint and not engage with my speech. This would be certainly not befitting my philosophical lecture today. When using a PowerPoint, I have to carefully consider its use and what value it would add. Since this is a reflection exercise, not a documentation, it would be more distractive. You would be reading instead of looking and listening to me. It would take up part of your attention, and you would be hearing less of my nuances. Now, what I did plan to do in this final part of my talk is show you some powerful visual examples in a meaningful way to illustrate that there are many ways of doing something and that not always are equal. These images will express what I want to say in a much more befitting way than my words can. So let me introduce you to the green desert. And when I talk about the green desert, I'm not talking about the green that is growing in a desert. I am also not talking about a desert that is becoming more green. I'm talking about monoculture forests. The more aerial point of view you take in it, the better you see it. And this shows also the value of the higher perspective, of course. So these monoculture forests, they are very different from the forests as we normally know them. There is no biodiversity. There are no dead trees giving life to other organisms. There are also not a lot of animals that live in these green deserts. These forests are very quiet. They are neatly organized, in contrast to a normal forest, and green deserts are often built with an economic bonus, the cut and replace mentality. So this looks very different from a regular forest as we see on this picture, and with a more aerial point of view on this picture. And here we see them together. This green desert phenomenon, not called as such by those implementing it, but by those critiquing it, is an example of the danger of getting lost in ideology and rhetorics and don't look at what is actually happening, how it is happening, and what the consequences are. Yes, as with the symposium example I discussed, there are initiatives to cope with our environmental crisis, such as these green deserts. But are they actually that different and meaningful? Green deserts count for our governments as forests, and these forests also count as quantity tree quota, while using them as a profitable resource that can be cut and renewed. Sounds like a win-win, right? But you can't compare young and old trees. You can't compare monoculture with biodiversity. And you can't have a quick and hasty solution to something that has been building up for a very long time. Even from before the inventions of cars and factories, we need to go way back to the point where nature became a commodity and something we consider to be managed by humans. Are we meaningfully reconnecting with nature with a green forest mindset? Or are the abstract discussions about the ozone layer and CO2 situated at the meso level, invisible to the eye, directing our attention away from the micro level? Are we neglecting the little things with a big impact? This brings me to the final part of my personal reflection on meaningfulness. Gratefulness, also a trait of meaningfulness. And gratefulness starts by remembering the spontaneous generosity of the natural life forces that bestow us with the gift of life. Not only does this natural force make our existence possible, but it is also the ultimate creative force, creativity itself. This natural life force that we are part of and provides us, enriches us, inspires us. This life force is what makes meaningfulness possible in the first place. Well, that was quite intense, no? So I'm wondering, what have you discovered during our journey? What have you discovered that is important, not unimportant, not important to be meaningful? What are the little and the big things? And when you think of meaningless, this lack, this emptied out of meaning, how do you understand it? Unfortunately, due to this video format, we can't directly exchange reflections after this talk. However, feel free to contact me to share them and/or discuss them during a direct exchange. You can find my email in the link below, and if I gather some responses, I might make an additional video to discuss them. So tell me, did you experience this video to be meaningful? Let me know. To be continued.